Hi, everybody.
Hello, audience from our previous panel that actually stuck around.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Cheers.
I would leave too.
No, I'll be back.
Oh no.
He has to be here. That's his job.
No, my shift ended.
Oh God, you're here on your own volition.
Well, I mean, I don't
sorry.
Huh?
home yet.
Okay.
Questionable.
Well, hello, YumeCon, and welcome to another panel, A History of the Video Game Console Wars, presented by the Foundation for the Eradication of Gen 5 Pokemon, because I still fucking hate them and want them dead. And we're here to talk to you about history of video game consoles.
Man, that guy asked a question about consoles. We said we were going to answer it
Yeah,
here, and he didn't even stick
and then
around
he just
for it.
fucking left. He was like, "Hey, what's the first instance of a plug-and-play video game console?" And it is actually the Magnavox Odyssey. So, the first home video game consoles released in 1972. Video game consoles did exist before 1972, but instead of things you could bring into your home, they were things the size of your house. This is Tennis for Two, being played on an oscilloscope, which is scientific hardware used to measure wind speeds. This was developed in 1958. No word yet on whether or not you can play Doom on it, but I'm sure they'll get there.
Or Skyrim.
Or Skyrim. Are they putting Skyrim on everything now too?
It was like an advertisement, like I think it was for an April Fool's joke where they put it on the fridge or something.
Yeah, Alexa
And
and the
then,
fridge.
Yeah, Alexa.
It was-
had like a text-to-speech.
It was a good meme.
My favorite is the people who are like, I'm going to beat Skyrim using a Rockstar guitar. Like, there we go. So, first generation of consoles. This is actually a Magnavox Odyssey. The thing I showed previously was Pong. These consoles started coming out in 1972. They were defined by having all of their games built into the console, meaning if you wanted to play GTA 6 when it came out, you would have to get the GTA 6 console instead of just, buying the game and shoving it into your console. They displayed graphics in black and white. Normally just a couple lines and a dot was about as much as you could get out of them. And they oftentimes the controllers would be affixed to the console itself. This is a rare instance where it has its own controller, but a lot of the times the console is the controller. They could run on their own batteries very frequently, which was weird. I assume that video game consoles back then could run on batteries because A, if you're familiar with how big TVs were in the 70s, it was kind of a pain in the ass to get behind one to plug stuff in. And B, on the off chance you're camping and have a generator but only one power outlet, you can plug the TV in and still play Pong. So this is the Magnavox Odyssey. It was the first console out of the gate. It had a lot of fun additions to it to allow it to be a fully functioning console. So here we have cartridges. I know previously I said that video game consoles back then didn't have cartridges. I fucking lied to you. The Magnavox Odyssey did. But these, you couldn't go out and buy new cartridges for the games. This just let it play Pong. This let it play Breakout. This let it play Pong 2. This let it play Ski. Because what these did was they just flipped switches in the console to collaborate. Collaborate is not the word, but whatever. To configure it so that it could play that game. So if you lost that cartridge thing, you couldn't play the game anymore. It also came with poker chips, dice, cards, all that kind of stuff, because back then consoles couldn't do a lot of things. This did sell about 1/3 units though, which is pretty good back then. Nowadays, if something sells 1/3 units, that's a catastrophic failure. But in 1972, that just meant, hey, maybe we should try making more video game consoles. So that's what Magnavox did. They released several more iterations of the Odyssey between 74 and 77, primarily to compete with other companies that were doing the exact same thing they were doing. Each new iteration included things like multiplayer, scoring, sound, and difficulty levels. Things you would need to have to be able to play a video game. Nintendo also competed in this generation. Most people think the first Nintendo console is the NES. It is actually the color TV. It was the only console in the generation to actually display color, meaning it was the only time Nintendo was ever the cutting edge of technology in a generation. And they collectively sold 3 million units between all iterations of this. Another major competitor back then was Coleco. So this is one of their first Pong consoles. Coleco did, however, release 14 different consoles throughout the mid-70s, and some of them got really fucking weird. Presumably, this is a school shooting simulator. Don't know what's wrong with Coleco. Yeah, GTA 4. These were pretty cheap. Like, this thing started at $50 in 1970-something money, so it's about $210 in today money, which is less than a Switch. The thing is, ultimately, these are all just iterations of Pong. That's all they're doing. I don't know how you use a light gun to play Pong, but, you know,
You do.
that's on them. The problem is, huh? Yeah, you shoot the arrows. So the problem with this was that if you see all of these and like the Magnavox and the Nintendo Color TV and all the other stuff, you're gonna get confused about what to buy because Grandma doesn't even know like what consoles you have to buy games for. There's no way she's gonna know what Coleco you want. So this did cause a small crash in the video game market as consumers were just overwhelmed with choices and decisions they could not make. Oh yeah, I do the second generation too. We know our shit. Hello, welcome to Console Wars, a panel we are doing until we start doing the Ash panel. So this brings us to the second generation of video game consoles. This started out in 1976. It's called the Atari generation because of all of these, the only one of them you can be sure of that I didn't make up is the Atari. The rest of these are definitely shops. That's the Vector X. I fucking love that thing. It's so stupid. So good. Built-in screen. Who thought of that? Insane people. So the first, this is where we started to see controllers that could plug into the console instead of being hardwired to it, though sometimes they were still hardwired to it. Even if they were hardwired, there were still cords, so you can, not have the console in your lap while you're playing games. And consoles started to have cartridge slots, so you could actually plug games into them instead of just, hoping it has everything you want on it and then never making another decision in your life. First console out the gate was the Fairchild Channel F. Its controllers look a lot like Wiimotes for Flight Simulator. And that's all we have to say about the Fairchild Channel F. It was the first console to take cartridges and the first console to take cartridges to stop being produced. Not a lot of people bought it.
What grade would you give it?
F.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean,
it's even in the name.
Yeah, they sealed their fate. They should have called it the Fairchild Channel S tier. We also had the Intellivision and ColecoVision. So the Intellivision here, for some reason, just has a full number pad and a weird disc instead of a D-pad, because at this point D-pads hadn't been invented yet. No one thought of the D-pad. It was just weird discs and joysticks. So the Intellivision had a speech synthesizer for some reason. Now you could it would try to pick up your voice. Now we know that's only okay with modern consoles. If you go back to the N64 with Hey You Pikachu, it was a fucking nightmare. So imagine how good it was in 1978. It wasn't. Next we have Coleco, which had the stunning strategy of selling an add-on to let you play games from better consoles. That lets you play Atari 2600 games. Here's the thing. Companies sell their consoles at a loss. So if they're selling the Coleco at a loss and an add-on to let you play Atari 2600 games, and then people buy Atari 2600 games, Atari's getting their money. Shockingly, bad fucking idea. Next we have the Odyssey Squared. People were kind of confused about whether or not video game consoles should be home computers. This is the natural byproduct of those two things having sex. It's grotesque. And then we have the Atari. So the Atari outsold everything else in this generation by a factor of 4. So that's why it's called the Atari generation. And Nintendo didn't compete because, why would you do that? This was an incredibly forward-thinking console to the point where you could plug a Sega Genesis controller into it and it would work. It also had the first instance of online gaming. There's AOL, Atari Online. You could download games through your phone jack. Huh? Yeah, in the 70s, you could download games. All you had to do was have a blank Atari cartridge for some reason. This is also when we started to get the advent of game genres. So like Pitfall is kind of the precursor to action-adventure platformers. And adventure is somehow not the precursor to action-adventure platformers based on its name. It's actually the first RPG.
All right, and that brings us to the third generation of consoles, which has some consoles you might have actually heard of, like the SG-1000.
Well, hopefully you were just here for that.
Yeah, but in case you hadn't heard of the SG-1000, that's because it was the Japanese-only name. They named it the Master System in the United States.
Or the Master System Girl.
Yeah, depending on where you bought it. And then the Nintendo Entertainment System. See, these are consoles you might actually recognize from the generation. There were a lot of other consoles in this generation you probably don't recognize because they were all hot garbage. In fact, there were so many consoles, people didn't know what to buy, and it ended up leading to the North American video game crash of '83. So this crash actually had a bunch of different reasons that it happened. So the first one was too many consoles. Many had seen how well the Atari went and thought they could get in a piece of that pie. Because it was $3.2 billion, which is a pretty big industry for the 80s. And with almost no entry level, just basic.
That's only like
hardware.
5% of Elon Musk's net wealth.
Yeah, but so the market was being flooded with just too many unique consoles. They all could only play their own games. So that meant at a store, you would have to stock a console and its respective games, and then have to do that again for each different console. When you have 40 different consoles, you can't dedicate that much space to all this. So you'd have to pick and choose like 3 or 4 consoles to stock. So it was really hard to find anything specific. You'd walk in the store, and they might only have 4 that you don't own. And then many game companies also overestimated how much they could sell, so they produced a lot more games than they were going to sell. So it ended up just in a landfill, like with E.T. The second was kind of the third party. People were just shoveling out games because they realized that they could just make a game, make some money, and it didn't have to be good as long as they slapped some tie-in on it. E.T. being the classic example of classic shovelware. It was terrible. Nobody should ever buy it, and they produced way too many and took a huge loss on it.
Took, what, one guy 6 weeks to make E.T.?
Yeah.
To be clear, it's not his fault. The company went, you have 6 weeks, you have to make E.T.
Yeah, and then third is there was competition from the computer industry. Let's see, I have them written down here. Where's my mouse?
I don't know, the mouse died again. Oh no.
The mouse is on the screen.
You're on the screen.
There we go.
I am.
I gotta go back one.
We have to go back,
There we
Kate.
Yeah, scroll down for me. Yeah, here we go. It was
A lot of notes.
Commodore and Texas Instruments were the two of the primary computer manufacturers of the time. And they were in a price war against each other, so computers hit the same price as consoles. So you could buy a shitty video game console like the Commodore 64, or you could buy a computer and do like home word processing and all that on it. So it was actually pretty stiff competition, all of this put together.
Better yet, you couldn't
Crashed
play
market.
E.T. on the computer.
So the market crashed. But luckily, Nintendo came through at the end of the generation to kind of solve everything. First off, they packaged a robot in with their console, because who doesn't love that? Second was they actually hired a QA guy, and they made it so that their publishers could only create so many games per year with the whole Nintendo star seal of approval or whatever.
Yeah, 5 games.
So it meant that instead of just trying to get as many games to the market as you could, you had to spend your time on games to make them good. So it made actually a level of quality. So
Or acquire bootleg NES cartridges, create a second to produce games on, or create a second company to release your extra games on. Yeah, there are ways around it, but most companies played by the rules.
yeah, so it led to a much higher base quality of games, so people got a lot better games. So overall, the Nintendo Entertainment System, you could say, saved the video game industry, because without them, like, the industry might have died in '83.
In America.
Probably would have been better that way, honestly.
Yeah,
You wouldn't be here.
We would all be successful. Yeah. I'm a fucking secretary, man. And it... Huh?
I work security.
Ew, gross. Anyway, fourth generation of consoles. So this is 1987. Notably 4 years before the Super Nintendo comes out. You know, the main console of the generation. This is where we started seeing a slow transition away from cartridges and towards discs, as well as a push towards polygons for graphical displays. We also saw dedicated handhelds entering the market. I mean, before this, there was like those Tiger Electronics games and Game & Watches. But this is where we started seeing like fully functioning video game consoles. This is also where the computer-based consoles that were being sold and video game consoles kind of split paths again. So we stopped seeing, video game consoles with full QWERTY keyboards on the thing. So two consoles I want to talk about first are the TurboGrafx 16 and the Neo Geo. Now, the TurboGrafx 16 was developed by Hudson Soft, the Bomberman people, the coolest of the mascots. It sold 10 million units through its several iterations, but at this point, that's not really enough to justify staying in the market. So despite a decent performance in Japan, this thing did outsell the Genesis in Japan. It didn't do well anywhere else. So even though they did make a follow-up console, it was just dead to rights. We also have the Neo Geo. Now, this thing costs $700 in 1991 money. That's like, what, $1,500 now?
Yeah, if you thought people complained about the PS3 when it came
out. So the reason the Neo Geo was so expensive, it was basically like the Rolls Royce of video game consoles. It was graphically way up there because it would play high quality arcade ports. So if you wanted to play a good version of Metal Slug, you got a fucking Neo Geo, baby. And you paid $300 for Metal Slug and you liked it. Had that really...
Basically an arcade board?
Yeah, that thing is functionally an arcade board. It is easily the most powerful thing that was released in its time, but its price point made it really hard for it to compete. And even though later on down the line they released a disc-based version of the Neo Geo, by then the PlayStation was on the market, so it just couldn't compete. And honestly, it was a worse version of the thing they released 3 or 4 years earlier.
I bet it's probably still pretty popular with enthusiasts because it's like a native arcade replicator.
Oh yeah, it's so good. Like, so I used to collect vintage consoles. I stopped. My friend still does. He has a Neo Geo. I've played that thing. It's so smooth. It's so fucking good. And then, of course, we have Nintendo and Sega. So Sega sold about 33 million units to Nintendo's 49 million. This will mark the last time in a while that Nintendo wins a console war. Nintendo is, family friendly. It's got this boxy or gray and purple display versus the Genesis's like smooth, edgy design. Kind of weird to call something edgy against a fucking box, but that's how it goes. Sega was really trying to lean into being provocative, so you got games like Night Trap that started a congressional hearing, and Mortal Kombat replacing Sand with Blood, which also got a congressional hearing. Really, Sega was just trying to get congressional hearings and piss off Republicans, which honestly fucking based. And then we had a lot of handhelds. So here we have the Atari Lynx, the Sega Game Gear, and the TurboGrafx 16.
It's
Great. Turbo Express. Sorry. Same company. Overall, great consoles. They had backlights, full color displays, were graphically pretty, not quite comparable with the current game consoles on display, but very good. And all of that meant there was no battery life in these things. And the main thing you want with a handheld is the ability to just shove 4 AA batteries into it and not worry about it for a month. I think the Game Gear, 6 batteries last you like 3 hours or something like that. Yeah, there's a reason that thing has a plug and comes with an AC adapter. You are going to just sit on your couch plugged into the wall playing that thing. You're going to like it, goddammit. So basically, if you're going to make a handheld, you probably want it to have a battery life. And because of that, Lynx sold under 1 million units. Turbo Express sold 1.5. The Game Gear sold 11, and this thing broke 100. Despite the fact that it doesn't have a backlit display, it doesn't display color, the screen is so fucking cheap, it's puke green. But it cost $100, it came with Tetris, and it had battery life. And that's all you need.
And Pokemon released on it.
Yeah, but it was fine. It was doing fine before that.
That's why my dad had to go hunting out for one.
So my first game, because I got a Game Boy Color, my first game for the Game Boy Color was Donkey Kong Land and Tetris. And then I remember a little bit after that, Pokemon had like come out pretty recently. And I was like, Mom, I think I want to get into Pokemon. And that's how I got her to buy me Pokemon. And it was the worst mistake I've ever made in my life.
That's why we're here now.
It's why we're here.
All right, and then we can move on to Generation 5, which is not Pokemon.
Thank God.
So this is where we had the transition to
upset.
3D, and not like gimmicky movie 3D, but like, or whatever Star Fox was doing, but like actual like 3D models. And then instead of cartridges, most consoles use discs. And there was kind of a radical shift in the market because Nintendo was king for a while. This is where they're dethroned. Sega just rots. Atari stops trying, and Sony just didn't make mistakes and did great. So first off, we have the 3DO. It was the first console out of the gate, hyped to high heaven. Time Magazine's product of the year. Several advanced features. However, the 3DO outsourced the console manufacturing to other companies, so it sold for $700. You know how console profits work is you sell your console at a loss and then you make up money by selling games and licensing fees. If you outsource the console manufacturing, those companies that are now making the console, that's the only time they touch the process, so they have to make money on the console. AKA, you have to charge $700 for your console. You can never cut the price because they don't make money if you do.
Would you care to guess which game developer's CEO was the one behind the 3DO? Huh? Electronic Arts. The CEO of Electronic Arts left the company to develop the 3DO. And for what it's worth, publishing fees for that console were way lower. I think it was like $3 per copy instead of $15. So it was so much cheaper to make games for that thing.
Yeah, so the 3DO, we believe it sold at least 1 million copies because we know there are at least 1 million copies of Gex sold. Also, they had some great ideas like only having one controller port, and if you wanted to have multiple controllers, you had to daisy chain the controllers.
Yeah.
So plug other controllers into
You would
themselves.
plug the second controller in there.
So if you have someone who like moves around by playing, yeah, good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm losing this fight.
And then the Atari Jaguar sold a cool 250,000 units. So it used cartridges instead of CDs, which was a problem. And it pioneered the brilliant strategy of not releasing any games. It was graphically superior to other things in the market, but it was...
But, yeah, so the Jaguar billed itself as being a 64-bit console. And whether or not it was a 64-bit console is generally up for debate. But it had 5 CPUs. And the problem was one of the CPUs for the Jaguar was very similar to a CPU used in the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. So what companies found they could do is they could easily port over Super Nintendo and Genesis games to the Jaguar. The problem is that those games were made for the SNES and Genesis, and they were trying to get the CPU, which was similar, to do something in the Jaguar that it is not set up to do. So when the games got ported over, their quality actually dipped. So even though you had a better console, it was running the games worse, which really did not help its reputation.
No. Then they added a CD add-on that just made it look like a toilet. So you know things weren't going great.
It's
for
living
them.
its best life.
And when things were at the bottom, they threatened to sue Sony for price dumping on the PlayStation.
They also had a cartridge thing in the back.
Yeah, so they
Even more like a toilet.
it was just terrible.
Well, you put the cartridge up at the edge of the toilet. So yeah, that would be the water reservoir.
Yeah. All right.
Sit on me, daddy.
And then Sega, because they had the Genesis.
Wait.
Sorry, another thing about the Jaguar CD is where you put the CD in, you press down, the lid presses down on the CD so hard that it doesn't spin. So a lot of them would just, it wouldn't read the CD.
Oh my God.
It's that
Lovely.
bad.
Oh my God, I love it.
That's terrible. All right, so Sega, just being Sega, was why they had the Genesis from the previous console. They didn't want to wait for the Saturn, so they released the 32X as a stopgap between the Genesis and the Saturn. But when the 32X came out in the United States, the Saturn was already out in Japan. So nobody wanted to buy the 32X because you could just wait 6 months and get a Saturn, which is a 64-bit console. And then
Initially,
Saturn,
it was wait a year, and then it became wait 6 months later on.
So, and then Sega decided the wonderful idea of having a surprise U.S. launch for the Saturn, where they didn't tell. So at E3, they announced, "Hey, you can go out and buy Saturns right now, 6 months early." But they didn't tell their distributors. So some distributors didn't get them because they didn't have very many produced at this point. So KB Toys was one that didn't get any, so they just promptly blacklisted Sega and refused to sell their products moving forward. Second, they didn't tell their third-party developers, so developers were like, yeah, we have till November to make this game, so we got this timeline planned out, and then Saturn comes in and they're like, well, our game's not ready for 6 months, so there's no games coming out until the original launch date, six months later.
But hey, there's PGA Pebble Beach.
Yeah, so you had the 6 launch titles and that's it. And then third, this controller. Come on, guys. Like...
You're right, that controller is hella sus.
I mean, also, Saturn had 2 discrete CPUs, the second of which they added after they saw a tech demo of the PlayStation, just to try to compete. So it sold at $400 and was pretty expensive for the generation. So that did not help them. Also, the 2 CPUs were really hard to program for, so 1 in 100 people could only program for it. So it was just kind of a miserable experience. They didn't have a great game library. And then we had the Nintendo 64, which somehow was the most powerful hardware of the generation. Go Nintendo. Last time they ever had that.
Yeah.
Unless you count the Switch because it was the only thing in the generation for a while.
What's its competition, the Ouya?
Yeah. So, but it was held back by the cartridges. Nintendo likes to have absolute control, and many companies didn't want to deal with the cartridges because it was more expensive on their end. So...
Actually,
they did
as a note, so I know a lot of people are upset that they have to pay $70 for a AAA game now. A lot of N64 games cost $80 in late 90s money. So, shut the fuck up.
Yeah, so the cartridges did have faster load times, so their game's quality was assumed to be better, but games had to be a lot smaller because the CDs could have much larger sizes. Nintendo mostly survived this generation because of their excellent first-party games. Like, they had crazy good first-party games. They just didn't have many third-party games. They had, Banjo-Kazooie, and that was, it.
Yeah, they just had Rare, and then Microsoft bought Rare.
Yeah. And because of this kind of abandonment by the third parties, they just kind of floundered in the later half. A fun fact, it's still receiving games to this day with Waluigi's Taco Stand. You can go buy this online. Go Waluigi.
Keep going.
And then finally, we're on to the Sony PlayStation. It outsold the combined competition 2-1, mostly because it just didn't make the mistakes all the competition did. Games came on CDs, unlike Nintendo. It was straightforward hardware, easy to program for, unlike Sega. And it never retailed for $700 like the 3DO. I mean, a lot of why this exists was because Sony got burned by both, I believe it was Nintendo and Sega. Because Sony was in a contract with Nintendo to build their next console, and the day they announced it was the same day that Nintendo announced they were backing out of the contract. Sony not a fan of that, so they drew up a contract with Sega to build a manufacturer console, based on, but it was a terrible deal for Sega, and they realized this, so they backed out of the contract again. So Sony got left hanging twice, so they just kind of entered the market out of spite, and they really worked hard to cultivate third parties. Support so that a lot of people would make games for their system, and it worked great. So they had a lot of great games. I'm just disappointed they didn't put Dash Station at the end of everything. And then finally we have the Dreamcast. It kind of exists in a weird space that's kind of like 5 and 6. I mean, it was fine, but it just couldn't compete with the actual Generation 6 consoles, so it just kind of floundered and fell off, and Sega gave up and started putting their stuff everywhere else. But Generation 6 was where we got 20th century consoles. Really, first generation...
21st century.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, first generation with cross-platform titles really being a focus, including computer, because before this, computer had its own ecosystem of games that weren't really compatible, like StarCraft, Roller Coaster Tycoon.
And Doom, which you can't put on anything except a computer.
So but this was where they started getting their share of the games and kind of sharing games because games were
Can this soundboard run Doom?
probably. This also marked where America was finally back on the market. Since the Odysseys went away, America hadn't been making console manufacturing until the Xbox. Online multiplayer first came into focus on this, and 2 joysticks just became the norm here. So the PlayStation 2 dominated this generation simply because it was a DVD player. And DVD players were new. A lot of people were moving because VHSs were terrible and miserable, and everyone wanted a DVD player. PlayStation 2 cost about as much as a DVD player. So when your parents go out to buy a DVD player, they're like, well, I can get the PlayStation 2, give Timmy a game to play too. We both win. So as more people bought the PlayStation, that means more people bought DVDs. So more companies jumped on the DVD train, which meant there were more DVDs floating around, so more people needed DVD players. So more people bought the PlayStation. So it was a fantastic feedback loop that really sent their profits to the moon and just allowed them to dominate this combined generation almost 3-1. So it had great games, introduced DVDs, and was honestly just great for the market. Other companies just were kind of okay. We can't not talk about the handhelds quick, where Nintendo just continues to dominate. The N-Gage and the Tapwave Zodiac just miserable.
What the hell is a Tapwave Zodiac?
It is probably some weird South Korean thing. South Korea made a lot of interesting handhelds that didn't go international well. I'd like to note on the N-Gage, this is the dumbest fucking thing ever designed. So, where's this speaker on the N-Gage, everybody? It's up there. And the microphone's up there. You have to hold it like a fucking taco. They fixed that in later generation N-Gages. You know what they didn't fix? You have to remove the battery to replace the game. The cartridge slot is behind the battery in the thing. Also, what is that display ratio? No, it's worse than that. It is taller than it is long. Try playing Sonic on that thing. You fucking can't.
With that attitude.
Try playing Sonic on that thing. It's fucking miserable.
All right, we should kind of blitzkrieg through the rest of this.
Hell yeah, let's go. 7th generation, this is the Game Wave. It is a DVD player that thinks it's a video game console, but it's not. Here's a George Foreman grill and the Xbox 360. Both of them collectively lost to whatever this random Chinese video game console is. And then we, of course, have the Nintendo Dual Screen and the PlayStation Portable. This thing very nearly outselling the PS2, but just failing, I believe, by like 1 million units. And this thing being a fully functioning PS2, basically, but, you know, on the go. No, it wasn't. Shut the fuck up.
It was.
No, it wasn't.
You never had a DS then.
I had both. I had a DS and a PSP.
Oh, did your
Yeah,
parents
well,
just
do you
love
have
you?
a launch DS? Because I have a launch DS, because my life is
I did have
sad.
that first model DS.
That's a blue one.
That's exactly the one I had.
Okay, good. You had the right one. Anyway, and there's Gen 8, their video game. Or are you Gen 8? I don't remember.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, Gen 8, PlayStation 4, basically just cultivated developers, really kind of stuck to their niche of we like gamers. Xbox One tried to kind of steal some of Nintendo's market of like, we're family friendly, Connect, camera always on you. You like this, right? People didn't like that. So,
The teddy bear is
and the Wii
watching.
U just didn't put out games, so it failed miserably. Handheld Nintendo 3DS, doing solid. PlayStation Vita, not doing so solid. But guess what? They're both losers because phones entered the market. They took over the handheld market.
I can play Doom on this thing.
and really marked the
I can play Pokemon
the
Sea Glass
end
Emerald.
of the standalone handheld hardware, which is why Nintendo kind of cannibalized that into the Switch. And they're still winning. They're, in fact, on track to possibly pass the PS2 as the best-selling
Get
console
fucked,
ever.
Sony.
And then PlayStation, Xbox are doing all right. PlayStation doing fine. Xbox doing a bit worse. We're also noting that we're starting to see more competition from unexpected sources. Like the Steam Deck is a direct Switch competitor because it's both kind of that hybrid hardware.
And it plays Doom.
It does.
Switch can't play Doom.
We don't really know what's going to happen moving forward, but for a while there was a weird phase where everyone wanted to do classic consoles.
Yeah, classic consoles. Basically, during the late Wii U era and early 3DS era, Nintendo was fucking dead to rights. So the only thing they could do to get money was to just like beat the corpse of the NES and the Super Nintendo, and they did it very, very nicely. Very tactful beating of the horse. Sony's was much worse. No, the Sony PlayStation Classic sucked. Anyway.